everybody. Welcome back to Reclaim You. Today we have a special episode because, first of all, it's our 30th episode. And also, all of us are here on the podcast today, all 5 of us, which just feels really exciting to celebrate the 30th episode and to talk about something that just feels really important given the, state of the world the past few years. And that's how to take care of yourself when it feels like the world is on fire. So this can be a loaded one. So we thought it would be kind of cool for everyone to come and pop in and share their thoughts and how maybe they take care of themselves and any just words of wisdom that can be shared with the collective. So, hey, everybody.
Hi. Hello.
So let's kick it off. I mean, there's been a lot going on in the past few years, right? I think that COVID was the thrust into a lot of stuff, a lot of heaviness. So yeah, let's start there. Laura, why don't you kick us off? How to care for yourself when it feels like the world is on fire?
For me, I think that one of the things I've learned certainly throughout COVID and perhaps even prior to that, but it's really hit home, I think, even more so, like the more that I experience things in the world, the more I realize that if I keep staring at the fire and walking toward the fire and getting myself engaged in where's the fire at and what can I do to put it out and the more likely I am to find no peace and no calm. So for me, it's been a practice of stepping away from, not dissociatively, like not like I'm going to zone out and like just binge Netflix and ignore what's going on around me or what have you. Not that it's not, sometimes we need that break, right? That's not a bad thing unless it's just the only thing. But for me, it's, limiting my news intake, limiting what I read, and being really mindful about how it's impacting me. And then I get out and I go into nature. And that's where I find peace. Like, I am fortunate to live near Valley Forge National Park, and I take my dog there and we just walk for miles, and it just allows me to feel like I am in the world but not in the midst of the fire. Like, and just breathing some fresh air, getting some perspective, and it's like a mindful meditative moment for me. And some days if I can't walk or if the weather doesn't allow it or what have you, I have a chair up here in my office, a corner where I sit, I light a candle, and I just sort of do a meditative sit. And so I say to people, start small, like give yourself 30 seconds if that's all you have, right? The fire and brimstone.
Yeah, it feels like such a balance of consuming what you need to feel kind of educated and that overconsumption that can happen where you just feel completely like immobilized in how you're engaging with yourself for the world or even advocacy and all of those things. Feels like a really delicate balance.
Well, it can be triggering, all of it, especially those of us who have trauma experience, right? What's going on in the world is very triggering. And so, for some of us more than others. So how do we care for ourselves and not let ourselves be hijacked by what's going on, but still care enough, right, to check in? I think, we still are in this world and are working with people and interact with people and in relationship with people who are impacted by this. So I think there's some element of knowing that needs to happen, but not to the point of overwhelm.
Yeah. When you said like for some of us more than others, like it just made me think of honoring our capacity. And it's been something that I've been grappling with a lot throughout, the past couple of years, and especially most recently with just like atrocities left and right. And I just, we sometimes use that metaphor, and maybe it's cliche, but like the cup being full or empty, like, are you pouring from an empty cup? And if so, how do you even like fill that cup an inch more? And yeah, I just throughout, thinking about this topic, thinking about how do we honor our capacity? How do we recognize within ourselves when we are so burnt out and our cup is very empty? Because I think, self-care is important for self-care's sake sometimes. And at least for me, and maybe this is just a personal value, like I think there are times in life, times in the world where like self-care for self-care's sake is wonderful. And also, how do I take care of myself so that my capacity is like broadened for taking care of others too, whether that just be one-on-one interpersonally or I can broaden my capacity to serve like sort of a greater collective, even if that means, a really small step that I take to serve the greater collective. So, yeah, you just made me think a lot about that theme or like that topic of capacity and like, where's our cup? Is it empty? Is it full? Can we fill it a little bit? And how do we do that? Just big, broad questions that I don't always have the answers to, but I'm thinking a lot about.
Yeah, and when we can't, how do we say no?
One thing that stood out for me that's been a big part of how I take care of myself, like in addition to what Laura was saying of like the more concrete, like getting outside, doing yoga, like all the things that make me feel good. This idea that to be educated, we have to watch the news. We have to have this like 24/7 stream of information coming in. That was hard, like to really challenge that and not feel like, oh, am I ignorant on this topic? Am I not doing enough? Am I not educated? Am I not learning enough? And even getting, comments from other people like, oh, you don't watch the news? Like, how do you know anything? Like, just there was so much shame there. And I do think ever since COVID, like that really hit home too. Like, that's not true. I can choose how to get information. If there's anything major, it will reach us. Based on how society is and technology and word of mouth. But outside of that, that's my decision, and that doesn't have to mean anything more than that. But that's been really helpful for me to reframe that.
I love that. I think that's so important because it speaks to this conversation that I have with clients a lot and myself is, the idea that you can feel an emotion, you can process an emotion, and it doesn't have to have a narrative, right? So like the idea that because you don't do this then means that. It can also be if you feel this, then this means that. And really, I think that can get you into such a shit show, especially in the climate we're in, is feeling grief, meaning that, I have to be that savior. I have to pile on all of these things that, are not, I'm putting that on me as a responsibility, right? And realizing, some things can mean things, but some don't have to, right? If I just feel grief and the world feels heavy, the world feels heavy. Feel it, right? Whatever that looks like. And then that's where self-care can be important. And I think for trauma therapists, like we preach this all the time, is like we can feel that stuff, right? To the capacity to which we can feel it. But then self-care is a supportive network to get you back to a place of safety if that didn't feel so good, which feelings don't. If you're a trauma survivor, they don't feel all that great. So for me, I just actually cleaned out my closet yesterday and found all these coloring books and art supplies that have collected dust. And I was like, okay, universe, telling me to do something. And I think I'm going to pull it out over the holidays because it's not something that I give myself the luxury to do because it feels dumb or it feels like a waste of time. And again, I'm putting that narrative to something that doesn't need a narrative. So I always think like making sure you're putting narratives only where they need to be and where they serve you.
I think the other part of that too, that both you and Emily made me think of this idea of false urgency or like false fires, right? That the news, that the way information is shared these days is one in which everyone is trying to have the loudest voice and reach the widest audience, right? And so we need to make space to be able to really assess, is this really what's this is, or, is this someone else's, or the, whomever is reporting this, or whomever's telling me this, is it this their stuff infused into whatever the news is, if that makes sense, whether it's a corporate kind of thing or whether it's, an individual who carries their own stuff and their own beliefs and their own, trauma even. And I think that at the end of the day, how do we create safe space that can't, or it's harder for that false sense of urgency, that it's harder for that to infiltrate that area for us, right? Like that there is a place that I can go in my home where I feel safe, where there's no news, no phone, no TV, or in my day, and to really, I think, sit with the feelings that I'm having and be able to separate them from other stuff that's out there, if that makes sense. Because I think, Casey, you're spot on. If we don't give ourselves space to really sit with, then we often find ourselves engaging in behaviors and, dissociating and things like that. We need that space, but it needs to be safe. So where is that safe space? Who are those safe people where I can sit with it? Do I have an accountability partner to check in with me? Like, what have you done lately? Gosh, you seem really keyed up about this lately. And, this is different than how I received you last time I was with you. Let's talk about that. Because sometimes we can easily get swept up, especially when we think of a trauma response, right? Like everything goes offline and it's just, I'm just feeling the trauma. I'm reliving the trauma. There's some narrative that's coming out of this based on my trauma. And, we do need support partners to help us find our ground again.
Yeah, as you're sharing that, I'm just thinking of, it was so long, right? 9/11. I think that was the first time I remember ever getting like consumed in the news. And I was, young, I was in high school. I didn't really know what was going on. And I remember just like it was on all the time. And then I flash forward to COVID, right? And the news was on because no one knew what the heck was going on, right? And there was a point where, we had to just like shut it off and disengage. And in thinking about that, I'm thinking of the folks right now who have this like internal generational churn from intergenerational trauma, and how that churn for many people, I mean, folks that I work with and that I love and care about, it's like ever present because of the things that are going on in the world and, just what's kicked up internally. And when you're saying safe, I'm like, yes, absolutely. Like what's safe enough, right? What feels safe enough when maybe being out in the world doesn't feel super safe right now? Is there a corner that feels safe enough to be in with your people, with your person, with your animals, whatever it is, to feel connected with or connected to?
And can you be safe from yourself, right? The parts of you that have those narratives that like, this is a waste of time. I need to work harder and faster and longer because we're a hustle culture. Like that's what we're told, right? My worth and my value is all tied up in my production and how I'm viewed by others. But, to be able to take a step away from that and reframe the narrative is important. Like that, as you said, Casey, to just get rid of the narrative and just say, it's okay. I can color. I can take a walk. I can lay on my couch and do nothing, and that is okay.
And speaking of like just safety, what I'm just like hearing and what's resonating for me, like so much of me finding safety lately has just been like deep belly breaths when I feel the panic rising up in the chest, and like having so much gratitude for that recognition of like, whoa, I'm feeling really out of sorts right now, or I'm starting to feel panicky, and feeling a lot of gratitude for that ability to like tune in and find the safety. So I sometimes I just have to remind myself it can be as simple as that. And sometimes that's not even so simple to like tune into some deep belly breaths. That can be really challenging. But all of what you are sharing is just making me think of the gratitude and what are like the small ways of finding safety when that panicky chest breathing starts to pick up.
Because the fire is an all-encompassing experience, right? Whatever that is, we won't even go into all of the atrocities that are going on and have gone on for most of our lifetimes, right? And whether that's this generation, the generation prior, like to what Sarah was speaking to, like those generational wounds coming forward. And because I think of grief often, I just think about how much grief is so rampant in all of the things that we're experiencing. And for people who, the younger generations or, people who have been so disconnected from their emotions, grief can be so unfamiliar. It can be so confusing. And, in the previous podcast we'd done on grief, like thinking about all of the like opposing ways that it can show up and, and also thinking about, do we want to find meaning in this? Do we not? It's your choice. Right? Do you want to find meaning in like why I'm here and experiencing this? right? I find that to be comforting sometimes. And again, I say that with a big caveat that that won't be good for everybody, and that's okay. But thinking about like the fact that, speaking to Abby, that the gratitude of our resiliency, that we can still find pockets of joy and also feel so much pain and suffering. And I just think that's so magical. And I know that's like a wrong, like, what a weird word to use when we're talking about the world on fire. But sometimes you gotta, right?
Yeah.
And I think it's just that idea that being a human is such a beautiful experience. And I just look at that sometimes, and sometimes it's hard to recognize that, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I think in seeing all of us together, I was thinking, oh my gosh, like all five of us with five different life experiences, five different trauma histories, five different family dynamics, and that we can all come together and benefit from one another, that we can connect with one another, that we can feel safe with one another, I think is just a microcosm of what you can find in society, right? That we were strangers at one point, and now we've come together in some of the most heinous years that we've experienced on this planet. And we're here smiling and having camaraderie. And I think that's really special.
I think that also, the world, the messages of the world want us to take a side,
Yeah.
right? To choose this or that. And sometimes we do take sides because it's obvious. And other times we're not sure. And other times we might be standing on a different side than someone else. And we get caught up in the argument of which side is right versus listening to each other to hear, right? Giving space for someone else's experience to be just as real and just as impactful as mine, even though it's drastically different. And even though I vehemently disagree with it. We're taught to hate each other. We're taught to disconnect further from each other. And I think absolutely there are situations when that is absolutely necessary, right? Like when something is profoundly damaging and hurtful and we need to not engage with it anymore. But there are situations where, we're caught up in trying to say this or that instead of, wow, both and. This can be true and this can be true, whether it's in my own life or in my life in relation to someone else. The two things can be true and there can be space for both. And that goes back to the point about like not feeling shame when we're not engaged fully in the news, because people are like, well, you have to, have your opinion. You have to this, that, or the other thing. But then also like, what is our capacity? And we need opportunities and safe places to expand that capacity so that we can begin to see there's more to the picture than this or that.
It's bringing up how necessary boundaries as well. Just this idea, like you were saying, that if someone believes differently than us, like we have to engage, it has to be this big thing, somebody has to change their mind, there's this right or wrong. That doesn't have to be true. We can set that boundary with ourselves and with others to just be like, you know what, maybe I value this relationship enough that I know that this is going to be damaging. So I'm going to set this boundary for both of us that we're just not going to go there. And that's okay. Like Casey was saying, that doesn't have to mean anything. It doesn't have to be good or bad. We're just taking that step back.
Yeah, to take care of yourself through preserving a relationship that feels important to you. Yeah.
And it's really taking, the boundaries that you're speaking of. I almost like visualize it, right? As like this messy, like rubber ball band that's like details and sides and perspective and, all of that, and just like unraveling it to 3 strands. Like it's all it has to be. You, me, and this boundary. That's it. We think so hard about like the details of, what's going on politically and racially and, all of these things. But, I think of when somebody, feels so strongly about what they believe, I zoom out, right? Like, what is that really speaking to? Is that speaking to like their stance on whatever? Or is that speaking to they want to be heard, or, they don't feel listened to, or things of that nature? So I encourage people especially with family and the holidays coming up, is like recognizing what is it outside of the detail, right? Could it be that, this person, feels very strongly about this because they've experienced something in regards to that. They've been touched by it in some way. Okay, like totally understand that. And we don't have to talk about it, right? Like, I got you, I hear you, but let's set a boundary. And I think that moves mountains with people because all they want to do is be seen, and can we see it for what it is and not the bullshit details, I think is important.
And that feels like the same thing with social media and the news, right? That boundary of like, maybe this is how much, or at this time, or when I start to feel this way. So staying in touch with yourself of like, how much, what's the dosing, how often, how much of it, it's like how much of it makes you feel even more dysregulated than how you are just living in the state of the world in the here and now, and over the past however many years it's been.
Yeah, and that relationship can be the all-encompassing sort of like goal, if you will, right? Like, I think so much is set up to break relationship, or is maybe set up as the wrong phrase, but there's so much out there that seems to move us toward breaking relationship, toward straining relationship. And with a boundary, I can set that to honor the relationship and the care that I have for you and for me. And can both things be true? Like, yes, you're having this experience of this thing and feel all of these things, and I want to honor that. But I also ask that you honor that I have my own experience of it. And that's part of what we're asking with that boundary is, we can talk to a point about this, but we know when that line is there and things start to get more challenging and maybe we can't see past our anger or our trauma or whatever's coming up in us, it's okay to step away. And there are people out there who just want to continue to argue. And I think that's also like being mindful of like, is this a relationship that is worth continuing to try to make happen if I'm not being honored in what I need while I'm trying to honor them as well? Tricky, but so necessary.
Yeah, I was going to say almost something along the exact lines of what you just said, Laura, like the both and can be true. We like need one another more than ever in these moments. Like even just speaking to what you shared earlier, Casey, like all of us kind of sitting here right now, like we need connection, we need community, we need one another, and also we need to take care of ourselves. And so it's like holding those two things at the same time feels sometimes impossible, but it feels like the assignment, the work. And yeah, I also am just thinking about how like digitally there's so much value in connecting this way, but for me too, and talking about how taking walks earlier, you mentioned this, Laura, like getting out and connected in the real world has been so supportive for my own self-care and also like relational care. And so for whoever needs to, I don't know, reflect on that a little bit more, like how can I also set the boundary with myself around digital world and move that out into like real world spaces. So if that is activism, like both are amazing. And, again, just something that I've been grappling with. Like sometimes when I'm so in it digitally, I lose sense of what's happening for me internally. And so finding that balance has been really important.
Especially when the digital world tends to feel so much more toxic than real life, right? And not that the internet isn't real life, but in-person human interactions, there's so much nuance that happens when you're like in the flesh with people versus, typing behind your iPhone or whatever it is. It can feel so much more grounding to be with people if you have the capability of doing that.
Yeah, and you're able to see them as human beings, right? Like it's a lot easier to be a troll on Twitter when a person is an avatar, like they're not someone I know or have ever learned to get to know or care for, right? Like the things that people say are awful. And reading the comments, maybe maybe let's not sometimes.
Yeah.
Let's not.
Yeah, it's really sad that we've lost sight of our shared humanity in many ways. And instead we just get caught up in a cycle of hurt. Like, I've been hurt, therefore I hurt others. And it just keeps on keeping on. And we have to step out of it and get some breathing space.
I think that really makes me think of, two things. One is, I've had a lot of conversations with, clients, the world around me, where, people feel like they're not doing enough, right? Just in terms of like, whatever, how Emily said, the information you're consuming, or, increasing your capacity, and like, it's okay. It's okay. It's okay. It's okay. Like, it's okay if you used, a coping skill you've been trying to get away from. It's okay if you're burnout. It's okay that you didn't set that boundary with, your uncle twice removed. It's okay. Like, you're allowed to be human. And if we're speaking about humanity, it's all of it's the messy, it's the raw, it's the oopsies, it's the screw ups, it's also the beautiful and the connection, the relationships. And, I think to myself, when I get clouded of like, what more can I do? I just think about, I say it to my clients all the time and they crack up, that like any interaction I have with a Wawa cashier is like where I can practice humanity. Eye contact, a smile, just any form of hi, right? Like, that is putting in the universe, like, I see you, I hear you, you're human, you're a person, we're connecting. And that can be on a deeper level if you want it to be. But any human contact you have is something to be acknowledged and celebrated. We can't change the world overnight. We got to start with mending the things we have around us. And so I think about that and I just go, right? You get that just, body feels safe, right? Like, it feels safe when you're compassionate towards yourself, but also realistic. I believe that I have unrealistic expectations of myself all the time, right? And note to everyone, check in with your expectations, right? Are you expecting too much of yourself? How do you know? Well, if you're burnout, you're probably expecting too much of yourself. And that's okay. But let's do something different. What do we need? What are we looking for? What will make us feel good?
How can we ask for help?
Yes. Oh, that's a toughie.
That's a tough one.
Yeah.
That also makes me think of, and this has come up with myself and in sessions as well, like this idea that, these terrible things are going on in the world. So like, I can't ask for help. Like, I'm not worthy to ask for help, or like, I can't have a bad day. I can't have a hard time because other people have it so much worse.
Yes.
And
Always.
just coming back to and like, okay, yes, we can acknowledge that these things are going on and it's terrible and we can't wrap our mind around that. And that doesn't have to mean that we're not allowed to be human and have our own emotions and our own lived experiences.
It's interesting. A very dear friend of mine lost her mother suddenly last week. And the morning of her mom's funeral, I sent her a text because I remember having this feeling in the wake of my grief after my mother died, right? But I think this is relevant to grief in general, that we will move through it and we will feel all of the stuff and maybe we'll be numb. And maybe in the middle of whatever's happening in this deep grief we're feeling, like our daughter will start running around the funeral and laughing and singing, right? Like, while there's our mother lying there and she's dead, right? Like, that life is something that continues on in the midst of everything that's happening. And we don't have to stop our lives and the joy because of all of the suffering. Don't we need that joy even more so, right? That like, how do we have that balance? How do we know that like, it's okay if I laugh, right? It's okay. At my mother's funeral, I remember, I remember just moments where my brothers would make some sort of joke and I would laugh. And it was like, out of sync with what I should be doing. But when I took away that expectation, it didn't matter. You know, I could cry, I could laugh, I could feel all the things, because quite frankly, any relationship, whether it's a person who's still here or whether it's a relationship with a greater body of people, all those relationships were full of those things. They were full of joy and sorrow, grief and hope. Some maybe a little too laden in one direction, and we have to figure out how we deal with that. But in general, there is still a sun that rises. There's still, you know, opportunity out there for us to connect with ourselves and others, and to find hope even when it seems like everything is burning it down around us.
I think it makes me think of, like, you know, looking at life subjectively versus objectively, where, you know, to Emily's point, I tell people, like, trauma doesn't have a score. It doesn't have a number where you can compare and that means something, right? And so I always tell people, look at your life subjectively. Don't look at, you know, to a point. This is, you know, obviously you have needs and money's important, but, like, don't let that number in the bank define what your life looks like. Don't look at how many friends you have and let that define you, or how many people, you know, you've helped during this trying time. Let that define you, right? Looking at things objectively, especially as we are all people who work with eating disorders and body image, it can be so toxic, is, you know, looking at life so objectively and that having meaning, right? I think there's a running theme for me in this podcast. Not everything has to mean something. But, like, how we've all been talking about, like, how does our body tell us our limits? How does our body tell us our capacity? Well, how does your body also tell you that you're doing good? You're doing okay, that you're appreciating, that you're connecting, that, you know, all of those things. And they can both exist at the same time. And you could be living the best moments of your life while also someone is experiencing the absolute worst. And that's just humanness, right? That there is no defining, you know, requirement for everybody to feel the same things. And I think that's what makes the world and humanness run so well to a certain extent, is that we're all experiencing something different. So if you think you can't ask for help right now, look at your life subjectively. Are you suffering because of not asking for help? What is it helping if you're not asking for help? Most of the time it's nothing. Nothing is helping if you're not asking for help. Right? And I'm sure we've all struggled in asking for help in this room right now. So, you know, we're not hypocrites in that regard. It's interesting. I think talking about the world on fire, you can't help but think about humanity and the fact that it still exists, right? I tell people that all the time. Like, look at everything going on in the world where people are helping and connecting and being with and showing compassion, because we lose sight of that.
Well, yeah, and there's that, like, again, like, pull towards the internet. That's not front and center, right? Like, that's not the control of the media and whatever controls that, whoever, you know.
Beats me. I don't know.
I know.
The idea of just, like, reclaim our lives for ourselves. We give our lives away so easily. We give our peace away so easily, and it's stripped of us. I mean, there's everything lined up to strip us of that peace if we let it. But if we think from, like, a somatic, you know, sort of like nervous system point of view, you know, if our nervous system has been living in this sort of hypervigilant, everything's on fire place, how do we start to bring it and balance it with what it feels like to be in a place of joy? So, like, that is why it's okay to experience that moment of laughter, that moment of joy, because I'm teaching my body that it is safe to be in that place, right? And that's such an underlying aspect of this that often we don't think about, is what is, you know, beyond our brains, what's happening, as you said, Casey, what's happening in our bodies? How are we experiencing these things in our bodies, and how do we find balance there as well?
What this whole conversation is making me think of is just Kristen Neff and her, like, whole idea of, like, this is suffering, all of this is suffering, and can we just, like, be kind to ourselves be kind to others, and like have like so much compassion for all of it. Those words were just like hovering over over the conversation as I was listening. And
Feels like a good place to start to wrap up. Does anyone have any other thoughts or anything they want to share?
So yeah, I'll just invite people. We did a podcast recently on gratitude, and I think that sort of plays into a lot of what we talked about today. And we have a lot of amazing podcasts beyond that, so that there's some really wonderful wisdom even here in 30 episodes worth of content, and we'll continue to offer more.
Life sucks. Life can be messy. Life can also be beautiful. You're seen, you're heard, you matter. We get you.
Cheers to 30 episodes. Yeah.
Amen.
Yeah.
Woo!
Yes.
And we're here to help.
All right, everyone. That'll do it for today. But make sure you turn in next week. Casey will be talking about the holidays and grief, and that really kicks off our holiday series of episodes over the next month. We'll be coming at you with all things holidays. So yeah, be sure to tune back in. And until then, take good care.